What's up everybody? It's Dan Pickett, co-founder here at Launch Academy, here to bring you another episode of the HTML show. In the last week's episode, we talked about how to essentially think of the web as a professional web developer, as a technician of sort of all the pipes and protocols and standards that drive the wonderful World Wide Web for us. And this was all a prerequisite towards what I want to cover in today's lesson, which is really, we want to practice like we play. So when we deploy our sites that we're building to what we call production, or to a live place where other users can get to it, we're using that terminology and that technology known as a web server. So what we want to do today is we want to mirror our local environment with what's going to actually be used in production. In 90% of the time, we're going to use either the Apache or Nginx type of web server, which is just a piece of software that's going to serve web pages to clients as they request them. And we're going to justify why you want to do this, why it's important to mirror your development environment with your production environment as much as possible. And we're also going to do some installation work together and get this going so that it's super easy, kind of plug and play for you to just get up and running with running a locally hosted web server, so that you can kind of practice like you play, so, like I said in the beginning. Also, we're going to incorporate absolute paths, and we're going to take a look at why absolute paths are better than relative paths when it comes to professional web development as well. So join us, it's going to be fun. And as I'm working through this, if you're joining us live, join us on the Slack channel, ask some questions, get some clarity. We're going to be working through some real tactical configuration and terminology related items today. So ask questions. I want to make sure that everything's clear for you as we move along. Also, I just want to say that if you are not joining us live, or even if you're just catching up to the run of this course, maybe this is 6 months from when it was originally recorded, I still want you to join us in the Slack chat channel. Let us know how the course is working for you, and be sure to use that Show Your Work channel so that we can provide you with code review and perspective. That's one of the best ways to learn as a professional web developer, is to get sort of the review and perspective of professional web developers and peers, so that the more code that you write and the more code that you study, the better you're going to get as you move along. So really important, get involved in the conversation there. I hope to see you there, and we'll make sure that the access is in the show notes as we progress through the episode. Awesome. All right, so let's talk about mirroring production and why that's important. So when you're developing web pages, it's really important to have your development environment match as closely as possible to what's in production. So what we love as web developers is we want to be able to reproduce behavior. We want to be able to essentially make sure that there are no surprises, or that there's sort of a least amount of astonishment when we make the change from working locally on our web pages to actually having them out in the wild and consumable by the end users of the pages that we're writing. So we really want to try to mirror the local development environment with what's in production, because it really follows that principle of least astonishment, which means that we're going to get less surprises when we make the change from working locally in a development environment to what our end users will experience when we ultimately go live with the website. So we use these terms of going live and having a production environment pretty interchangeably. What do they actually mean? Well, essentially, whenever we're releasing or publishing our web work so that it's publicly accessible at a place that makes sense for the end user, that's when we say we're pushing those code changes to production, or we're going live with those changes. And later in this course, in future episodes, we're going to do exactly that. But before we get there, we have to get our development environment to match as closely as possible with what we're going to use in production. So let's dive into that. So how do we get up and running with a web server? And if you remember from last week's episode, a web server is just a piece of software that sits out on the network listening on a particular port to basically serve client requests with HTML responses over the HTTP protocol. And there's kind of an agreement between the browser as the client and the server as the server to basically communicate using this HTTP protocol. And there's a lot of nuances and intricacies to that protocol. We cover that actually in depth in both our online and on-campus programs. But for the purposes of our exercise today, we just want to be able to communicate over that protocol for the purposes of mirroring our development environment with production. So there are a few options to do that. We can install and configure either Apache or Nginx manually, and that really requires quite a bit of industry knowledge around the command line, how to configure and build C++ and C scripts. It's really kind of a systems administration domain, kind of an advanced kind of thing for developers to be able to understand. And because this is a zero prerequisite course, we want to get you up and running as quickly as possible and as user-friendly as possible. So we're not going to actually go through that process today. You can find some great tutorials on how to do this online, but I recommend if you do go and decide to go that route, that you first build the proficiencies in the command line and navigating the file system in the command line, because that's really, really super important to be able to administer a web server. But for our purposes, we really want something that's user-friendly, quick, and easy to use so that we can locally host our web pages. And there's actually a few options. And I want to focus actually on options that are either using the Apache HTTP server project or Nginx, which is kind of a lighter weight web server software that we can use. And again, you can kind of build and configure these pieces of software essentially, if you were running a Linux-based server, either in the Amazon cloud or the Rackspace cloud or even with Google, right? So these are sort of the foundations, the development underpinnings of some of the tools that we're going to take a look at in just a moment. But just know that these are considered advanced pieces of software to install and configure, and they really do require that competency around the command line, and to a certain extent messing with configuration files and things like that. So it's quite a bit of a rabbit hole to go down. The other thing that we could do to run our web server locally is we could run what's called a virtual machine. So there's been amazing advances of essentially being able to run machines inside other machines. In fact, that's how the whole Amazon cloud works, is we basically have this huge piece of hardware and we essentially divide it into chunks, and we allocate those chunks to what we call virtualized environments. So we're essentially running computers inside computers, which is a really, really cool technology that's become very prevalent in the last 10 years. But to use virtual machines in this virtualization technology, again, we kind of need that DevOps and systems administration background and knowledge and context. And that's not really going to work for our zero prerequisite course together. But I do recommend, if you have an interest in that kind of world, there's two tools that are becoming very, very popular in this discipline. One is known as Vagrant, and the other is known as Docker. And these are virtualization technologies that allow you to run web servers on Windows, Linux, and also OS X or Mac operating system, so that it's super easy to run what we call containers or operating systems within other operating systems. Really, really cool stuff, but definitely out of the scope for this course. So thankfully, for beginners like us, we can start to look at some more user-friendly tools that give us access to a web server through a user interface. And there's really a couple here. And one that a buddy of mine really kind of just gave me a cool tip literally just this morning is a Chrome extension that will actually install a web server for you. I really recommend you check it out. But again, this web server is actually not based on Apache or Nginx. And we, as professional web developers, we want to practice like we play, and we want to mirror our production environment. So we're going to not use this tool for the purposes of today. But if you're on a Linux system, this might be a really wonderful option for you to get started with locally serving your web pages. If you're on a Mac, there's two additional user-friendly tools to get up and running with a local web server. One is called Anvil, and it's at anvilformac.com. And it basically just provides you with a pretty UI for hosting your local web pages. And the other is called Hammer. And Hammer does a similar thing, but it's a little bit more what we call close close to the metal, which means that you may have to edit some configuration files and things like that. So if you're looking for a user-friendly tool that's specific for the Mac, you can go ahead and try Anvil. And then lastly, there's this sort of AMPS tool that essentially not only installs Apache, but it also gives you a PHP interpreter, a Python interpreter, a database. So it's a really, really cool system. But again, like Hammer, this system also requires a little bit of munging with configuration files and things like that. So for our purposes today, for both our Windows and our Mac users, we're going to use a tool called MAMP. And MAMP is a very popular tool that you can basically download and install. And what it's going to do is it's going to install the Apache web server, the Nginx web server, the PHP interpreter, the MySQL database, and it's going to give you a super user-friendly interface to manipulate and work with all of those systems. So go ahead and go to mamp.info and go and download the software that's right for your system. So it supports both Mac and Windows. When you hit the download button, it's basically going to take you through an install wizard. And it looks like this. Just bring this up. And this is, specific to the Mac user. It's just going to take you through an installation guide here. And the thing that I wanted to point out is I wanted to ensure that once you go through, you actually customize your install and get rid of MAMP Pro. You don't have to install MAMP Pro. In fact, it's going to kind of get in the way and complicate matters for our purposes today. So go ahead and download MAMP. Install it and make sure that you have an option to customize it and just go through and not install MAMP Pro. Super important. So once you go through that installation process, you'll have MAMP installed locally on your system. And if you're on a Mac, you can just go to Spotlight and launch MAMP. So hit that magnifying glass in your top right corner, type in MAMP, and you're good to go. And we're just waiting for this to come up. And we're waiting. Feel like we need some of Spencer's beats as we work through this intermission here. All right, so I'm gonna just close this down and rerun it. MAMP, you're letting us down here. All right, here we go. So this is the experience that you're gonna get. It's gonna open up a web page, and it's also gonna open up this little window here. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to essentially go into your preferences, and we're going to customize MAMP. We're going to configure MAMP here and get this working in a place that we're most comfortable. So remember in last week's episode on how the web works, we talked about IP addresses and port bindings. Well, we want to assign a port by which Apache is going to listen. And if you recall, we talked about how Apache by default will run on port 80 or port 443, depending on if we're running HTTP or if we're running HTTP over secure socket layer. For our purposes locally, we can actually run them on a non-default port. So actually running it on the default here, which is port, 888. We're going to run Apache so that it doesn't conflict with any other software that's installed on our system. But what's most important is to configure your web server. So what we need to do is we need to tell the web server what directory we're going to host so that we can use that in development of our applications. So I'm actually going to change my document root to point to this week's episode folder so that I can actually host the web page through MAMP. So this is the most important piece of configuring MAMP. You want to make sure that you point it to the directory by which your HTML web pages and all your assets are hosted. So we're going to point to that. And we're on episode 10. And I'm just going to select this directory. And then I'm going to hit OK and see how it's updated here, and it's pointing to that directory. So what that's going to do is that's going to restart the server. And then what I should be able to do is I should be able to go to localhost with a colon in between, and then the port number that I assigned, which is 48, and I should be able to go to hello.html. And here we go. Here's our website. And what's different here is, if you remember, previously we were opening these up using a different protocol. And I'll show you what that looked like. So notice the difference here. We're connected over HTTP now that we're locally running our web server using Apache here. So we're using the HTTP protocol. Now, in our second tab, where I open this up using the command line, we're actually using the file protocol. And this is the main point and thesis for today's episode, is we don't want to run our web development using the file protocol, because our end users are going to be experiencing our web page over the HTTP protocol. So we want to practice like we play, and we want to run our web development over HTTP so that we can essentially mimic what our users are going to experience, which is going to reduce the variability when we move to production, and it's going to reduce risk for us as developers, and really practice that principle of least astonishment, which is super important. Cool. Okay. So we talked about how to install and configure MAMP, but there's one more thing that I want to cover in today's episode. Now that we're practicing like we play, and now that we're running over HTTP, I want to talk about the advantages of using an absolute path versus a relative path. And if you remember, in our HTML documents and also in our CSS, we used what's called a relative path to point to various resources in our HTML working directory. And what we can do now that we're using a web server, and now that we assigned a place at which all files are being hosted, we can actually use an absolute path versus a relative path. And an absolute path is actually significantly better because we can move files around, whether they be images or CSS or HTML documents, and we don't have to worry about updating paths. Everything comes off of the same root, which is our O10 directory in this case. So how do we structure an absolute path versus a relative path? Well, quite simple actually. All we have to do is just introduce a slash in the front of our references to external files. So this applies to other HTML web pages. This applies to the CSS documents that we're linking. This applies to any images that we're referencing throughout our document. So I'm going to go ahead and update all of our relative paths to absolute paths in our technical document here. So we're going to use an absolute path to point to technical interests. Now notice I'm not going to update these because they point locally to a location in the HTML document. This link points to an external HTML document, and this link actually points to an external CSS document. So these require absolute paths, whereas these are still considered relative location paths. And these are fully qualified paths with our protocol, our host, and our path. So we don't want to update those because they point to completely different URLs. But we do want to update this relative path in our image tag. And that should do it for all of our external references that are not pointing to external URLs. And we just would want to do the same in our technical interests.html document. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Awesome. Hey, and I just want to say, if you've been enjoying this course, we're at a wonderful place here where you get a feel for what we're doing here at Launch Academy. If you're interested in hearing more about Launch Academy Online or our on-campus program, I recommend you jump to our site and actually just fill out an application or sign up for an informational call. We're actually really excited in our online program to be offering a 14-day free trial. So go ahead and reach out, ask some questions, learn more about the program. It's not unlike what we're doing here, and I hope that this course has really instilled some confidence that you can do this. You can become a professional web developer, and if you're interested in learning more, please reach out to us, get in contact with my buddy Max in the admissions department, and I promise you he'll take really good care of you. And later on in the course, we're going to be excited to be offering all of our HTML course students a one-time offer to go ahead and sign up with us. So I hope you'll join us and continue to learn more as you advance through this course. Cool, all right, so let's jump back into sort of changing these absolute paths. We changed all these absolute paths to from relative paths to absolute paths. And what we should do, again, tightening that feedback loop, we're going to go back to our locally hosted web page in the browser. We're going to refresh it and just make sure that nothing's broken or changed. So our image still points to the right resource. Our CSS is still rendering. So those absolute path changes we've made was successful. So we did that in the context of our HTML documents. Let's do it in the context of our CSS. So you remember from our previous episode, we set our background to a relative path as well. And thankfully, now that we're locally hosting our web page, we can change from a relative path to an absolute path. So what we're going to do is we're just going to get rid of the two dots that basically take us up a directory from a relative path standpoint. And we're just going to change that to an absolute path. And if we've done everything properly, we refresh the page and our background image is still rendering. Awesome. So that is really going to do it for today's episode. I just really want to encourage everybody to get up and running with a local web server and to practice like you play, mirror that production environment locally so that you get a consistent development experience and you practice that principle of least astonishment. But I also want you to go into your HTML documents and your CSS documents and change all of your relative paths to absolute paths. It's going to provide you with more flexibility as you start to move your documents around, and it's just a more defensible, better way to produce your websites. So get your local web server up and running and change those absolute paths to change those relative paths to absolute paths. And we'll see you in next week's episode where we start diving into some of the elements and principles of CSS positioning and responsive design. I hope to see you there, and as always, I hope to see you in the Slack chat channel. Don't hesitate to reach out to me directly if you have any questions. We're on this journey together, and I really want to see you be successful. So we'll see you next time, and I'll see you in the Slack chat. Thanks. Bye-bye.